Is Jazz?
Public live on the topic of regulating mood. The session that we're going to be doing today is a question and answer session. So that is to say that we're going to be asking, or rather you're going to be asking us questions as we go throughout this session, and we're going to be doing our very best to answer them. During the current pandemic, mental health has really come into the forefront, and we as an organisation have decided to bring the opportunity to the wider community to have this out with us every couple of weeks or so that we can perhaps gain some invaluable insight and bounce around some ideas with our team of lived experience coaches.
Absolutely.
We are here to specifically answer any and all of the questions that you bring to us. We will always do our very best. But like I say, today we're going to be putting a particular emphasis on regulating our moods. Who are we? We are not academic.
No, we're not.
We are not medically trained. But what we are is a team of people with lived experience. And what it is that we hope to bring to these topics is the invaluable insight that we've picked up along our own journey so that we can share techniques and tools and tricks for how it is that potentially anybody might start to empower themselves to manage their mental health better. That is what it is that we can offer. With regards to myself, I am a wellbeing coach with Seropia, and what that means is that I spend the majority of my week day in, day out on the front lines, if you will, of mental health, supporting our members so they can better understand their mental well-being, so they can better manage their mental well-being, but ultimately, coming back to that word as well, empower themselves to lift themselves out of their mental well-being issues.
And I'm Jazz. I'm also a wellbeing coach. I focus, very similar to Charlie, but I focus more in our kind of community side of Iseropia, where we work to keep maintaining and managing the skills that have been taught in the process during Iseropia and to really action and move forward in progressing with our, improving mental well-being. And I definitely come from lived experience background. I've got some formal education, but most of the skills and the things I talk about very much from my own lived experience and how I'm using that to better my own personal well-being and my journey.
That's it. I think it's really just an opportunity to share the insights that we've gained along the way. You know, when we talk about mental well-being, everybody is unique, right? And
Absolutely.
Different things are going to work for some people and some of the things may work for others, but all we are ever trying to do with these sessions and the stuff that we do in-house as well is just garner an opportunity to share some of these thoughts so that we might gain some wisdom along the way and ultimately put ourselves at the centre of the picture and manage ourselves better.
I think it's really important before we do start this, so if you aren't aware of what we do here, if you are a member at Iseropia, you'll be aware that we run live sessions on our private Facebook area. This is a public Facebook area, so please know that if you're commenting, please feel free to comment. We want as many comments and as many questions as you can throw at us, preferably relating to regulating mood today. So please feel free to ask them in the comments. We have got the comments and we will go through them as the time goes past, but this is a public forum, so anything you do post will be on public on our public Facebook. So just to make you aware of that before we start. Don't feel like you have to. We'd love you to if you want to, but don't feel like you have to.
Absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning as well that we can't necessarily see the names of the comments that are coming up as well. Actually, we've got a few people who are already interacting with us, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yes, we have. We've got a few.
Hello, Jazz and Charlie being one of them.
Hello, guys, and fabulous hair.
Oh my goodness.
Yours interesting hair, Charlie.
Interesting. The one guarantee that I can give you is by the next time you see me on a public live, I will have lost the bush. It will be somewhat tamed, somewhat trimmed, and hopefully a bit more manageable.
That's good to know.
It's the longest that this has been in a very, very long time.
Brilliant.
So, moving on to the actual topic. Today, like we say, any questions that you have, anything that comes to your mind, please just ask, and we will do our very best.
An interesting question last week was how did we have so many preloaded questions? And the reason why we have a lot of preloaded questions is because for the week on the before we do the lives, we asked for questions on all of our social medias. So all of these comments have come from social media, from collecting them throughout the week and collecting your questions. So if you have asked some questions during the week to go on this live, they should be on here today. We can't get through to everything, but throughout the live we will get through as much as we can. We're also going to be making sure that we're keeping an eye on the comments to our any questions, but at the moment most of the comments are regarding your hair, which is brilliant.
I've seen. Yeah, it's the thing about doing public lives, you can't take back what you say.
No, you can't.
We're locked in now. Anyway.
Right, so let's go on to the first question. The first question we got, I believe, from our Instagram was why is regulating mood so important? Why is regulating your mood so important, Charlie?
So this is something that I've kind of come to realise in my years of working with members, is that fundamentally, for a lot of us, regulating our moods, or issues in regulating our emotions more specifically, can start to form the centrepiece of why it is that we struggle on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I can ask a question here, and this is just kind of, it's a Socratic question that might get a few answers coming to your mind, but what came first? Your struggles in managing your emotions or your mental well-being issues? I realise that quite quickly you might come to realise that that's a chicken and egg question, really.
Definitely, yeah.
Is what it is, because what we will find is the two are inextricably interlinked. If I think back to my own experiences of when I was at my worst, when I was really, really struggling in my mental well-being, I can start to understand that actually almost every single time it was because I was experiencing some form of heightened emotion or another. I don't know if that's true for you as well, Jazz.
Yeah, I think when I started my journey, the path for my mood being deregulated was the fact that there was just so much emotion to regulate. The emotions started to brew up, and the more they start to brew up, the more, the more difficult it was to then manage the moods that were coming through. For me, it was very much a case of there was just a lot of emotion.
That's it. So it's a lot of emotion.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. And it can feel completely overwhelming. And it could be that at its core, our whole experience or issues with mental health could be that we just struggle to process emotions, potentially the same as either the next person along. And that can really start to form the centre of why it is that we find ourselves struggling. It's a really interesting one for me. And this is a theory that I've started to prescribe to quite recently, is that the majority of mental health illnesses, the common ones that we hear spoken about, besides a select few perhaps, so besides psychosis, schizophrenia, perhaps even bipolar disorder to an element has a biological perspective, the rest of them almost like reflections of our own inability perhaps to process our emotions. And that is why, for me, it is such an important topic. I'm just going to give an example now. Let's say that I was walking along the street, perhaps I was with you, Jazz.
Okay.
And in this situation, you're able to regulate quite well.
Yes.
And I am not able to regulate so well. There's an event that happens, we both find ourselves becoming quite emotional as a result. Let's say that we see something that's quite distressing. With you being able to regulate well, you might feel affected in the moment, but over the passing of time, within perhaps a few minutes, maybe even a few days, you'll find yourself coming back to a place of contentment.
Yeah.
If I struggle to process my emotions, I could find myself sitting in that feeling for a much longer period of time. But a fundamental fact about life, it doesn't slow down.
No.
It is always going to throw us curveballs, is what it's going to do. And as we come across these curveballs, if I'm still struggling with the emotions that you've managed to pass through, something else happens, you'll manage that, but then I've got more that's added to the inner turmoil.
Yeah.
Escalated.
And it's a little bit like a cycle, because the more we then start to recognise we're not regulating our emotions, not processing our emotions, we then start to get emotional issues from the fact that we can't regulate our emotions, which then very quickly tips into anger, guilt, shame, and it becomes a cycle where we find ourselves being frustrated at our frustrations or being upset at our upsets. And it's a little bit like if you had to close for a reason, close a shop, and there was just a load of customers out in a queue all the way down the road. You're not processing that transaction, so the queue's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you're left with all these transactions to complete in a small amount of time, and you find yourself getting overwhelmed. You find yourself getting completely, processing emotions isn't a fun job anymore. It isn't something that you enjoy. You don't enjoy having these emotions. You want to get rid of these emotions. You don't understand how any emotion or any transaction can be good anymore, and you start to process it differently. The way you process starts to become tinged with whatever emotion, whatever kind of emotions it's making you have, and regulating mood is really important. Regulating your mood is important because it helps you to process the day, it helps you to process your lives, it helps to process the feelings, and it helps to get you a much better relationship with the feelings that you have and emotions in general. That actually emotions can be a beautiful thing.
They can be, and that's the fundamental thing about emotions. All of them exist ultimately to try and motivate us towards positive change. We might not always recognise that, but I love the analogy that you were using there, specifically around, when we're feeling overwhelmed, it can tinge the way that we might manage them. And if we're really struggling and feeling overwhelmed, we might find ourselves turning to destructive coping strategies.
Yeah,
we might, in a bid to avoid or suppress our emotions, just turn to something that's outright destructive. And that can then start to link to so many other areas,
Before we move on, there's an interesting comment from Facebook. Yes, my schizophrenia has an impact on me at a biological level, but many of the issues I had were around negative self-talk, anxiety, about things that haven't happened, ruminating on the past, etc. I think that is a really, really brilliant point, that actually our diagnoses can have a biological effect, absolutely. My biological diagnoses have an effect on me, but actually it's the behaviour we pick up along the way, the kind of the way we then speak to ourselves, the way we then manage and see the world, that we can change and things can be impacted we can work on those things and work on the regulation of those things, and it sounds that you've that a good insight on the difference between actually a diagnosis is one thing, but it's not just about a diagnosis, it's also about the things around it, the things that we do as a result of the diagnosis that are something in our control, if that makes sense.
I mean, it makes total sense.
Absolutely.
And this is the thing, when it comes to our overall mental state, I think I've talked about this certainly in some of the previous slides as well, but there are always a set of 3 different factors to come. There's the biological factor, which is the one that perhaps we might need medication or other support to be able to manage, but then it affects negative self-talk, for instance there.
We spoke about it in the last couple of slides about the biopsychosocial model, about there is a biological element to a lot of mental health concerns, and that's not just a diagnosis that you're born with, it's a load of different biological differences and causes and things like that. But then you've got the psychological side, which is things like talking to yourself negatively, and then you've got and that anxiety related, and also the sociological, that's the word, past experiences, the environment around us, the way how our practical lives are affected by what's happened. All these things then affect our well-being, and I think it's a really important to say that there's so many different elements to any person's mind, isn't there?
Well, that's it, and this is where it can become, or it can feel like it's a really complicated web. It can become like a mire of different things that are starting to cause the issue. Just that comment's so perfect, and the way that it demonstrates so much self-awareness. Negative self-talk, one element, the emotion that comes from that, because perhaps in your mind you're spending more time in different areas, but fundamentally this can also start to lead to beliefs that we might be too complex potentially for certain things to work, and this is certainly something that I used to think I was too complex for any kind of tools or tricks or insight to work on me, and it's something that we do occasionally see with people that come through the service, this belief of complexity. But if we can start to untangle the web, all the way that these different factors start to affect us.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really brilliant question that was asked, and it kind of links onto the biopsychosocial model and the way we regulate our emotions and the environment, and that's: does living a solitary lifestyle make it harder for you to regulate emotions and taint your view of the world and people? And I definitely would say yes, in certain it has a potential to, definitely. If you are quite isolated, I can only go from my own experience. I was quite an isolated person. I had people around me, but I didn't really engage with them on a level that on a healthy level, so to speak. And what I found myself doing was becoming quite resentful of people and resentful of people being quote unquote normal. And it did taint my view on people, because I was angry that I wasn't doing things as fast as everybody else in my age group. I wasn't achieving. I wasn't. The world was corrupt or wrong because I wasn't really kind of linking with it. I wasn't understanding it, and because I wasn't regulating my emotions, And because of that, it really made it really difficult to then regulate my emotions, because I was having not only so many emotions, but so many emotions that weren't weren't rational, but they weren't realistic. They became a lot more twisted. Reality kind of dropped a sense, because I wasn't connecting with people. I wasn't practicing being social or social norms. I wasn't practicing. I wasn't evidencing any of the beliefs that I had from the world around me. Anything could have been the truth, even if there was no evidence for it. And my brain started to not be able to process the emotions, the realistic emotions. It started to only process the really negative ones, which then really built this feeling inside me of not liking the world or the people, being stuck outside of looking in. That was certainly my experience from it.
You've really eloquently answered that last little part there, haven't you? The way that, our interpretations of the world can then start to affect our emotions, but also our emotions can then start to affect our view of the world. Absolutely. They are almost one and the same, is what they are. Solitary lifestyle. I like the way you started to answer that, particularly because, yes, in essence, a solitary lifestyle, I would argue, would certainly make it harder, perhaps, to regulate your emotions.
Yes.
But you do also hear stories of people that take themselves off the grid, they remove themselves from society, and that can prove to be a really good thing, because in that essence, you might be taking away a lot of the triggers, the things that actually push you in to emotion. But I would make a pretty strong argument for the necessity of us having not a totally solitary lifestyle. I really do believe as well that it is important for us, if not vital perhaps, for us to have at least one good intimate relationship in our lives. And there are so many different theories around this, but it really starts to meet our emotional needs. But by having a good, trusting, healthy relationship, what that enables is the ability to share, to have conversations, to talk to a good listener. Because how often is it that we can find ourselves falling into emotion because we're locked in our own minds, because we're not seeing an alternate truth?
Yeah, and having a relationship with somebody doesn't have to be a relationship as in a romantic relationship. Having a connection with somebody, having a person to have conversations with, who understands your mindset, it's quite good for bouncing ideas. It's quite good actually for processing your emotions, which is how you regulate your mood. If you've got if I'm having a bad time, I can talk to somebody. I can talk to you. I can talk to somebody in my friend group and things like that about the situation. It helps to get it out. It helps to regulate it. Helps to have it in the air and process it. There was an interesting analogy. Jane, who is one of our well-being life coaches, therapists, she said in one of the courses that I did with her, where she said that sometimes it's an element of the way we regulate emotion is the way to process it and put it in the right place. So if you've got an emotion that's particularly there and particularly present, but actually the cause of that emotion was a very long while back, it was something in the past, it's about putting that book back where it's supposed to be, in the order that it's supposed to be. And it helps to process it, to have it out.
Like reallocating your energy.
Yeah.
Almost.
Definitely.
But certainly having good listeners really helps with that. And it doesn't just stop with our work as well. In all aspects of life, how important is it for us to be able to communicate effectively, to have our needs understood and met, so that we can better move through our emotions? And what is effectively happening whenever we're having conversations with people in our work as well, who might present to us with a lot of anxiety, for instance, or a lot of anger? We'll take the time to listen, to talk to them, and then the word isn't challenge, but we'll gently start to discuss what's going on with them, to help them to see perhaps an alternate reality, a reality where that book is back in place, potentially, and they can find themselves moving through their emotion. So I would say, to answer this question in a couple of words, it makes it harder. I would argue yes.
There is, but as you said, there's a reset thing, isn't there? If you feel like you need to reset, if you feel like you need to, have some space to process that emotion for a short amount of time, moderation is where we come back to all the time, isn't it? If you need that time alone, and have that solitary time alone, as long as it's not for an extended amount of time, like a period where you are going without seeing people and connecting with yourself and the community and the people around you, for a long extended period of time, it's sometimes good to have that break. Yeah, it was a really good question. Thank you very much for bringing that in.
Very good.
And while we're talking about kind of lived experience and our experiences, this is a good question. What emotions have you struggled with? And that's a very broad, interesting question.
I think, there are a couple that come to mind, and I suppose some people might recognise themselves in this as well. Anger, anxiety, guilt, shame are the first ones that come to mind for me. But anger, specifically, the emotions that I struggled with, I had what I would describe as a universal anger. There was a lot of self-hatred that was going on, so there was anger and frustration at the way that I was living my life and my perceived inability as well to get to where it is that I wanted to go. But I harboured a lot of anger, believing that society had left me feeling the way that I was, that for whatever reason I hadn't been supported enough, that I hadn't been given the same opportunities as other people. And I, for a very long time, had anger issues, not probably the way that you'd expect them to be presented, but resentment towards the rest of the world. And that certainly didn't help me.
Yeah. And I can relate to that. I had that, a lot of anger, a lot of self-anger, a lot of self-hatred. Mine was very much guilt. A lot of guilt, a lot of shame in the way I looked and the way I was, and the fact that I was still not moving on and moving forward. But anger was always the one that I struggled to regulate. And generally, mood regulation for me, it was the difference between excitement was one of them. I find it extremely difficult to regulate to regulate excitement because I get very, very excited in things. I get want to get my hands on it, want to get the most expensive version of whatever the thing I'm into at the moment. And I can really struggle to bring, even though it's interesting, because even though it's a positive emotion, it's a happy emotion, it gets you excited, it is a positive thing. Too much of it, just like anything, can be quite negative.
It becomes destructive, potentially.
It becomes destructive, and that's definitely where kind of the anger and all the negative ones started to slip in, when I would overshoot the very positive versions of me, the very positive emotions I was having.
Exactly. Then leaves you vulnerable to some of those more painful ones as well. And there's kind of a bigger point to be made about this as well. There is no such thing as a bad or a good emotion in my books. There's healthy and unhealthy, but they can happen in both kind of sides of the spectrum. So, for instance, positive emotion, excitement, becomes a problem if it's overstretched.
Yes.
But it's the same with negative emotions. They're to motivate you towards making positive change in your environment. All of our emotions are trying to communicate to us that something needs to change. But too much of a negative emotion, and it's debilitating, is what it is. It stops motivating, but it starts to create obstacles.
Absolutely, and I think that's when we're talking about, struggling with our emotions, the first things people can fall quickly into is low mood, depression. That's the assumption when we talk about regulating mood, but it is so much broader than that. And actually, it can change. You can struggle with mood one day, low mood one day, and then it can be struggling to regulate. So, struggling to regulate your emotions in general, there's some core ones that tend to revolve and be there, but actually, once you're starting to struggle with one, I found in my personal journey that I then started to struggle to process the other ones as well.
So it's like that cue analogy that you were using.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
And this is a really good follow-up question to that. I feel like I can't control my feelings. Is that a bad thing?
So, this is my gut instinct. Immediately, I'll come to a distinction. I can't control my feelings. No. I would say that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't like the word control, and that's why I would immediately say no. Sometimes what we can start to do in our own minds is to build up this idea that in order for us to successfully emotionally manage, we need to have this ability to control our feelings. A couple of facts. We cannot get rid of our emotions. We really can't get rid of our emotions. They are part and parcel of the human experience. And often, in a bid to control feelings or emotions, we can then start to take ourselves down some really destructive managing paths. Really destructive. If we're not talking about control, I would rather talk about management. It's probably the better way. Recognizing that we will feel things, that's going to happen, that is a guarantee. It is about managing our experience of those emotions so that we can quickly and efficiently de-escalate back to a place of just feeling all right, a place of contentment. But I do take issue with the word control.
Yeah, I agree. I think we sometimes, when we're so used to not having regulated emotion, we can fall very much down the trap of, in order to control our emotions, we have to either suppress them or they need to be our definition of perfect, which usually means no negative emotions. We're happy all the time, we're content all the time. That's not realistic. And I know that might burst some bubbles, but unfortunately it just isn't. We're not going to feel contented sometimes, and sometimes we're going to feel emotional. We're going to feel those, those more negative emotions, quote unquote negative emotions, and that's okay. I think feeling emotions and having those feelings is absolutely perfect, because if we suppress our emotions, we don't regulate them, because we are spending too much time trying to control the effect of the emotions that we then don't process the emotions.
I just love the analogy you gave at the start. It's like closing the shop again. Is what
yeah,
it is.
It's closing the shop again. It's letting that queue come up, and what we end up doing is we end up having a really bad relationship with our own minds, where we just count every little human emotion that we have, every reaction to things, and we say that is an inherently bad thing, regardless if it's when we're struggling to regulate our emotion on something which is quote unquote minor, which it might not be for anybody, whatever that might mean to you. But then we start to believe that we can't regulate our emotions when really emotional things happen that we're allowed to, of course, at any time we're allowed to feel emotions, but are very much justified. Like, when I lost my grandmother, I felt like I couldn't regulate my emotions because I was feeling emotions, and I was feeling sad, and I was upset and letting myself go down. That was absolutely normal. I'm allowed to feel that.
That's it.
And it's about differentiating when we need to work on managing and regulating those emotions, where they're starting to, they're starting to come up and they're overloading us, and actually saying, admitting to ourselves, we don't need to control our emotions. We just need to help ourselves to manage what's going on in that time.
So you not even need want to, is what it is.
Yeah, want to.
It draws me back to, is this a bad thing? Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're finding that it's affecting you and it's something that you want to change, then it's something that you might want to work on as well. But the key word, recognizing that we are going to feel emotions, recognizing that all of them are valid as well, all of them are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Extend self-compassion is absolutely where I'd go with that.
We've got a comment in the we've got something in the comment section. Hi Charlie, hi Jazz. Hope you're both well. Because I'm really struggling with my BPD and CPTSD. I need help so much managing them, especially the splitting with BPD.
Ooh.
That's a really, really interesting point. Thank you very much for bringing that. Sorry, we can't see names in the comments, but thank you very much for bringing that. When it comes to, we can't go too much into diagnosis, but in general, when we talk about, PTSD and BPD, regulating mood comes from a variety of different things. And splitting is a particular one. We talk about that. For those who aren't aware, splitting is it's black and white thinking. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's kind of yes, no. There isn't a middle ground. There's not a grey area.
No grey.
And when we're talking about addressing splitting is it's a habit that we get into. And actually, the way we do it is by challenging ourselves and challenging that emotion. Putting ourselves in accepting with an open mind that something might be different, or that we don't have to always have the same opinion for that opinion to be right either way. Does that make sense? It is a really tricky thing. But know that you're in a place of, you can talk about it and have these conversations. And actually regulating your mood, in my experience, it comes from a lot of practice. It comes from a lot of awareness and forgiveness, and telling ourselves, I'm allowed to feel this. I'm allowed to validate what's gone on for me in my life. I'm allowed to feel, and I'm allowed to have this time to process it. Don't feel that you have to completely cure everything all the way, and cure every emotional connection or misconnection that you've had. you're in a place where, you know, any change you make to yourself, any change in your mindset, or any little thing you challenge every day that you not normally challenge is a massively positive thing, especially when it comes to regulating our mood. We're not challenging that, accepting it and saying, do you know what, I'm doing the right thing. Doesn't feel like I'm doing the right thing right now, but I am doing some right here, that I'm doing the best that I can.
I'm going to approach this question as well, if you don't mind. I'm going to weigh
Absolutely,
in on this
go
one.
for it.
But I'm going to come with a bit more of a direct, or quite a direct way of looking at this.
Go for it.
And you can take it or leave it, is what you can do. If we're looking at BPD, so borderline personality disorder, a lot of that is going to start to potentially revolve around the way that we interpret things. Going back to black and white thinking, it's the labels that we're going to start to slap on things. This person is the best person in the world for me. Then they become the worst person potentially after they make a small transgression from one extreme to the other. The first thing that we want to garner with BPD is, number one, just an awareness of that, which I think the commenter is clearly showing by understanding that they're going through a splitting motion. And the skill then comes from being able to catch yourself doing that. So go through the emotion, waiting for it to pass, realizing perhaps what it is that's going on. You're splitting, you're putting things into extremes. And then the challenge comes in. And the challenge revolves around recognizing some of the thoughts potentially that have led you to these feelings towards that splitting, and then gently, as always gently, showing yourself perhaps an alternative truth, taking it back to the facts. So often it is our interpretation of situations which start to compound our emotions. If we can take out our assumptions, then we can take it back to the facts. And what we'll find is, if we look at a situation of facts, often our emotions will start to subside a little bit. So I'll give a very quick example around this. I went to a barbecue a couple of weeks ago, and it was a social event. It was my friends. I've had a history of social anxiety. It's a thing that I consider really, really well managed at the minute, but occasionally in small moments it will resurface. And what I found myself was, the next day after it, I was ruminating. I was like, did I come across weird? Did I come across negative? Did I seem okay in the social situation? This is all my thoughts and interpretations. I took it back to the facts. I went to a barbecue. I saw my friends. We had a laugh. Those things, none of them could possibly make me feel anxious. And it's refocusing on the facts.
Sometimes the best thing we can do when it comes to challenging the negative thoughts, challenging splitting and things like that, is actually to ask ourselves, is there any evidence behind the thought? And saying, you know, if you're saying, oh no, this can't possibly be the right thing, what's the evidence to suggest either way? And if we're challenging, for example, like your example of people's emotions, people's behaviours, what would people think, these kind of feelings, actually, if they had something to say, they are human. They have to tell you that. If they want to express an opinion or things like that, they can say that to you. And actually, until then, you don't need to feel like, you know, you have to act on something that might not possibly be the opinion. That was a bit garbled, but it's definitely I hope that's answered your question.
Highlights that difference there. And I would just say, CPTSD, it might be worth seeking some more support around that. I certainly don't feel qualified to give too much insight on that. All right, I can see we've got another comment.
How do you? Oh, sorry. It just takes a little bit of a while to. How do you deal with someone who is a narcissist and only feels anger and rage and lacks empathy? So we do a course at Israel called the Give Foundation course, and a part of that we talk about is the control wheel. And in that we talk about things that we can and can't control. One of the biggest things that we unfortunately cannot control are other people and their emotions. What we can control, and the only thing we can, is the way we react to that. And it's so difficult, because when you're going through something, or you're at the receiving end of somebody else's anger, somebody else's rage, somebody else's inability to show empathy and reciprocate that relationship, whatever that might be, all we can do is allow ourselves to reach out for that support, talk to people, and find ways to manage our emotions in that moment. And then have a look at what practically we need to do to either have that discussion with that person, or if it, and worse comes to worse, how can we get that person out of our lives if it gets to that point?
Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for mentioning that. I think the thing that we need to remember as well in relationships as well, in managing emotions in relationships, is that we really need to protect ourselves. Not all of the time, of course, there's compromise, right? Sometimes
Absolutely.
we do need to put ourselves out. But you've used the word narcissist there. That's a very strong word to use, just to be clear as well. If they are genuinely a narcissist, the best thing that you can do is start to put in boundaries, start to dictate for yourself what it is that you will and won't allow into your life from that person, change the nature of the relationship to it's a place where they can't affect you potentially as much, or like Chaz says, if the red flags continue, if there is a lack of understanding and nobody wants that anger and rage and lack of empathy in their lives, then perhaps we're faced with the trickier decision, which is we might need to end that relationship altogether. Worth thinking about. And
working on the things that we can control. If you feel that you can't, for fears of being things like lonely and things like that, it's about telling yourself, do you know what, I deserve better in this situation. I deserve to be loved, I deserve to be treated equally, I deserve to have my needs and my emotions met. And however that needs to be met for you, whether it be reaching out, whether it be getting some support, whether it be finding alternative people in our lives to discuss it and have some honest time with it, definitely do that, because what we're aiming here is for better well-being for yourselves, even if that means, unfortunately the worst situation is letting people go. And it's a hard decision, but by reminding yourself that you deserve wellness and you deserve to have a happy and fulfilled life, it helps to make that decision. Helps making that decision a little bit easier, because we're a bit more sure of our decisions, sure of our worth.
Absolutely. Should we have a look at the next question?
Absolutely.
I'll have a tackle of it. I fancy a question.
I believe it's, how can I get rid of my emotions? You alluded to this earlier about getting rid of your emotions.
Right.
You kind of answered it, but you can't.
Yeah. So, okay, I would love to take this question, because again, going back to control, it's this idea that we can get rid of our emotions that can be just entirely so problematic. Again, we can't get rid of our emotions, but we can manage them. Just to really tie into this notion of getting rid of our emotions, how often is it in a bid to try and control, suppress, avoid, or compartmentalise our emotions that we find ourselves engaging in outright destructive behaviours? Sometimes, in a bid to get immediate gratification, to pass, or not pass through, but to push away that painful emotion, we can turn to things like drink, drugs, alcohol, which is also drink.
It is.
Oversleeping is another thing. Overeating, undereating, right? Self-harm falls into this category. Overgaming in a bid to escape your reality. Excessive social media use.
Very simply put, we find ourselves trying so hard to control the uncontrollable that we then take it out by excessively controlling what we can control. That wasn't simply put. That was very complicatedly put. But in my personal journey, what I found myself doing was I was trying so hard to suppress the emotions that I was then finding areas in my life that I could control that would kind of give an emotion, whatever that might be, and then just trying so hard to keep it in a certain level, under a certain amount of control, and then that control became more addictive, more obsessive, and that is one area of emotional kind of trying to get rid of your emotions, trying to suppress it, throwing it into work.
Do you mind if I ask? Well, do you have an example of what that would be?
What, getting rid of my emotions?
Yeah, some of the tools that you might have used.
So when I wasn't very well, I was a drug user. So if I was feeling like I needed to escape my emotions, I would use drugs. I would drink excessively. I would binge drink and binge and just do drugs. That was my thing. I wanted to feel like I was the life and soul of the party, and I could control being inebriated. When I felt like I had to put myself down a peg, when I felt like I wanted to show myself how unwell I really was, and to fulfill that need to be feel that to validate the feeling of being broken was one of the reasons I would do it. I would binge eat, and it developed from comfort eating because I could control it to binge eating to the point where I would feel all this pain, all this guilt, all this shame, all this anger, and it was something that developed into an eating disorder later on.
Because I was just saying, it gives you that control and that immediate
it gives you the control.
calmness on it, is what it is. But this is something fundamentally true. If we want to learn to manage our emotions, a lot of the time we're not going to be able to go for the answer that gives us that immediate reward.
No.
We're going to have to look longer term and start to make decisions so that we can ride through our emotions, ultimately resolve them, but with our long-term happiness at the centre of the picture.
Sometimes the short-term things, the coping strategy is what we would call a coping strategy or a distraction technique, whatever those are. Coping strategies, sometimes we fall to negative coping mechanisms because even though they might be an inherited quote-unquote negative emotion you get from them, you're still able to recognise what it is. You're still able to control it. Even though it might be negative for you and it might be a negative effect, you find yourself affecting your, at least you've got the control over it, at least you know how it feels. And then it's really, as you said, it's the long game. They're going,
it has to be the long game. I can see that we've got a really nice comment that says, I don't get rid of my emotions. Instead, I note them, investigate why I'm having the emotion, is it based in reality, and then take action if it is something I have control over. Bingo.
Bingo. It is really important, and that's a really, really amazing comment. And I definitely agree, that's the way to go back, noting it, processing it. Sometimes writing it down is so profound and really important. One of the points to go to would be, if you feel like your emotions are completely overriding you and you feel like you cannot control any dangerous coping mechanisms that you might feel like you need to do or might have urges to do, this is the time where you then reach out. Don't be afraid to reach out. If you feel like your emotions are so overwhelming that you cannot control yourself or the actions that you're going to take, reach out, get some help. Have somebody to talk to. That might be the crisis team, that might be a GP, but if it's getting to the point where you're feeling in danger from your emotions, getting rid of them isn't going to be your long-term goal, but trying to reach out to find the support to help regulate that is so important. I just want to say that before we moved on to our next question.
And that's a very good point there. Recognising that sometimes it is out of our control.
Yeah.
And the need to reach out to support GP. I think you might mention crisis line as well if you're based on the Isle of Wight, but this is also where if you're identifying with anything we're talking about, you might seek a referral here potentially as well. Worth considering.
There's two questions, but I'm going to merge them into one because I'm very conscious that we're 45 minutes in. The question that this is is there any other conditions that aren't mental health that affect regulating mood? There is also a question that is, does not managing my physical health needs affect regulating my mood? So I'm going to answer them all at once. I think that's going to be a really, it'd be more a kind of, we can get both of those answered in one. Yes, there are many conditions that aren't mental health diagnosis that can affect the regulation of mood. Endometriosis, I cannot say it, endometriosis.
Endometriosis.
That's the one. That has a massive link. For women, anybody who menstruates, these kind of anything to do with your hormone imbalances can really affect it. Testosterone imbalances as well can have massive effects on your mood. So hormones or any hormonal conditions can have a massive effect.
Huge.
Also neurodevelopmental disorders, so ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, they all have links to the inability to, not the inability, but to some struggles relating to regulating your mood. Some in addressing social cues, recognising sensory overwhelm. These can all affect regulating our mood. Chronic pain. Pain. Any kind of pain. Long-term illnesses can affect regulating our mood because we can become distant and isolated. Isolation is another one. Age is another one. There's a ton of conditions that can affect the regulation of our mood. And in fact, in the very broadest sense, any condition can, if it's not managed, or if we have it takes an emotional toll on us.
So recognising that there are so many different routes into why we might feel dysregulated, any physical health condition, which is more my area of understanding around this as well, can start to affect you. You know, there's some really interesting links that we can see as well. You know, we can talk about chronic pain or physical pain affecting the way that we feel. You know, if some of you have a life-changing injury or a physical health condition develops, that means we can't then go and do the things we used to. That will affect our ability to regulate our mood.
Yeah.
But what I want to talk about very briefly, fibromyalgia, which to my understanding is almost like an unknown quantity when we start to look at it perhaps on a more medical level. It is largely unexplained to my knowledge, but what we do see is that there's this incredible link between the fibromyalgia, the debilitating physical health side of things, but also our mood. The two are interlinked, and as our mood improves, often we can see the fibromyalgia starts to lift as well, but vice versa. So, you know, the mind and body are so interlinked.
Absolutely.
We are biological machines, and the brain is a part of that biology.
And a commenter said, my diet and exercise routine has a huge impact on my mood. Eating nutritious food and having regular exercise instantly improves my baseline mood floor. Absolutely. The way we fuel our body physically has a massive effect on how we process the emotion, what the intensity of the emotion comes out, and ultimately how quickly we are processing and then kind of getting to a place of well-being. That's a really, really brilliant point. Thank you very much for bringing it in. So we're moving on to more. This is a really, really good question. How can I control my feelings?
I would love to take this one if you don't mind. Again,
absolutely.
we'll ignore the word control.
We'll ignore the word control because I know how much you like it. So how can I regulate my feelings? Should we go with that?
We'll go with that. So this is kind of, it's a generalization, but when we look at the route for us going into any kind of emotional state, what we can identify is that there is a trigger. That could be an event, it could be a situation, it could be a place, a person, a thought. You know, it could even be a smell or recognizing a voice that sounds like somebody that you used to know. A trigger is the first point. The second thing that will happen in most cases is that we will find ourselves going to a place of evaluation. That's what I like to call it. And when I'm talking about evaluation, again, it's that psychological aspect, the story that we're writing to that event, the inner narrative, the way we interpret it. Going back to that splitting thing, how are we labelling it potentially? And you know, that could all be in black and white or a world of grey. Won't go too far down there. But then we will effectively cast an opinion about that event. Depending on the quality of that evaluation, depending on the thoughts that we have associated with the event, we might find ourselves brushing it off, or we might find ourselves going to a place of emotion.
Yeah.
And depending on the severity of that evaluation, we might feel light emotion, or we can feel that damaging, overwhelming emotion, over positive, over negative, debilitating, creates blocks. When it comes to us managing our emotions, we can look to those three things there to perhaps better understand the things that we can do when we are confronted with emotion. First thing, trigger. Is it practical to remove the trigger? If the answer is yes, and sometimes it is yes, then brilliant, we can get rid of that. So just to give you an example, if I had a toaster that really bugged me every morning because it burnt my toast, no matter what setting I put it on, it's probably practical for me to just get rid of that toaster and buy a new toaster, or switch from having toast in the morning to something else. That's practical. I can deal with that relatively easily. Potentially as well, it isn't always as easy as that to get rid of the trigger. So there was a comment earlier about a narcissistic relationship. Perhaps we can protect ourselves and remove ourselves from the narcissistic relationship, but perhaps we might need to do some work around also managing our interpretation of the situation. I'm not saying that's directly applicable to that example there. When it comes to having a look at the way that we interpret the situation, we want to garner an awareness of where it is that we're putting our focus and our meaning. And what we'll find a lot of the time is that when we're becoming emotional, we're putting too much emphasis on the negative or a distorted reality.
Absolutely.
And then what we need to start to do at that point is to, a little bit like there was a comment earlier that said, investigate with kindness or passion or something along those lines. Yeah. I've just lost it on the screen for a second here. But then what we want to start to do is understand it and move ourselves by changing our mindset to a place that is more reasonable and rational as well.
I think one of the best tips I ever got when it came to regulating my emotions or controlling my feelings, whatever that is, regulating my feelings, was the timing of regulating your feelings is the most important thing. If you feel overwhelmed by those feelings, if those feelings are something you can't put your finger on, you can't rationalize, they just you don't understand why they're happening, that is not the time to figure out why you're having those feelings. That is the time where you de-escalate your feelings. So that's the time where you use grounding techniques. There's always a common joke around, the basic grounding techniques, like, kind of going for a walk. These things, having a bath, these things are there primarily to de-escalate the very, very intense emotions. They're there to bring you to a point where you can at least try to explain why they're happening, or figure out what could have been the trigger. Sometimes when our emotions are so painful, even if they're quote unquote positive emotions, there's so much of them that they're filling up your head. You need to get rid of that kind of you need to get rid of the cue. Going back to the very first analogy, to be able to really, or at least the cue needs to become more manageable before we can then go, okay, what am I going to do now to get this through more efficiently the next time? We sometimes set so much expectation on ourselves that when we're feeling really, really bad in ourselves or really, really unwell in ourselves, that we have to fix what's going on, the situation, the reactions we've had to all of our past experiences, the coping mechanisms we might have had for years, the behaviours that we've learnt from people in our past, the biological element. We have to fix it all at once, otherwise we've failed in our pursuit of controlling any of our emotions or our mental health. And that is so unreasonable.
Dispel that.
It's so unreasonable to set that on yourself. Actually, every small thing you do to regulate that emotion is going to be so important, and it's going to be so powerful in the end.
That's it. And off the back of this, we're kind of presented with a few things. So besides removing the trigger, we'll either find ourselves in a place where we can start to manage our thoughts, but like you were saying, the cue is happening. We're feeling overwhelmed, the red mist descends, we're having a panic attack potentially as well, and at that point our brain is hijacked. Thinking is going to be nigh on impossible, is what it's going to be. And it's at that point that we need to turn to, like you say, those strategies to help us just move away from the event time-wise, because what we'll find is that, generally speaking, the closer we are to that thing that triggered us, time-wise, the nearer the event, we're probably still going to be feeling that emotion. But manage distraction, talk to good listeners, positive coping strategies like going for a walk, taking a break, self-soothing comes into it, and then you will start to get back to a place potentially where you can then address those fundamental thoughts and beliefs. There was again that comment from earlier that said, have a look if there's anything that I can change. If it's in my control, I'll then change it.
Yeah, finding a time that's going to be be useful for you to then process that emotion helps to make a more profound realisation on why we're having these emotions in the first place, or where the trigger might have come from. And actually, when I was going through my journey and I was in quote unquote, I was in crisis. I felt I was in a crisis point. I would get very angry when someone suggested that I had a walk or took a bath or had a cup of tea, or but actually in hindsight, those weren't there to fix the situation for me. Those were there because I needed to de-escalate the really raw emotions that I was having, and then I would be able to do the harder work on myself of actually processing what was going on.
Get to a place of clarity.
Yeah, and sometimes it's about having the expectations on what these tools are going to help you with when we're doing any work on ourselves. There's a very similar question, I think, to end the session, which is what can I do when I'm stressed?
So it is very, very similar, but I think what we can do is we can start to continue perhaps the conversation that we're already having around this. if we find ourselves caught up in that pent-up emotion where we're not able to rationalize our thoughts, where we're not able to make distinctions between what is true necessarily in our own interpretation, we need to create space, is what we need to do. That's the bottom line. And there is a very nice anagram that we like to discuss in-house actually, called STOP. It's not a graphic that we have, I'm afraid.
It's not a graphic that we have.
It's not a graphic, but I'll do my best to articulate it for you. STOP is spelled STOPP, and the idea is that it's a few steps that you might want to take yourself through when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling overwhelmed. Very good. So the first S, stop, literally what it stands for. Stop, just take a break.
Yeah.
Stop exactly what it is that you're doing right there in that moment. Because recognizing that if you follow through with that emotion, you might act in a destructive way. T, take a breath. It is just a continuation of that, is what it is. It is again adding another gap, just becoming aware of the in-breath, being aware of the out-breath as that goes through as well. Next, O, observe. And when you're ready in that moment, you want to start to, hopefully you've de-escalated a little bit, start to observe the feelings that you're having, the thoughts that you're having, but in a non-judgmental way, a compassionate way, because recognizing that they're valid and they do exist there for a reason. They might not be right, but they're there for a reason.
Absolutely.
So observe them, become aware of what it is that's trying to communicate to them, reflect on whether it's whether it's appropriate or not, and whether it's something that you have control over or not. P, put it in perspective. And what this refers to is, we often describe it as kind of taking the helicopter view, going above yourself, above the whole situation, trying to understand how you're feeling in the context of what it is that's going on for you in that moment there. And again, understanding the consequences of perhaps taking one direction or another with the way that you might want to manage that. And the final P, when you've done that, when you've extended some compassion to yourself, you've better understood the source of what's going on, and you've decided on the direction you want to take, P, proceed. As simple as that. Take that direction, which is going to help you move through the emotion, but also puts your long-term well-being and happiness at the centre of the picture.
Absolutely. And using the stop method is there to give you that, exactly what you said, that space. It gives you that time to work it through in a more manageable way, in a more structured way that our brain's going to cling to. And it's really useful. Someone in the comments said something, said about a workshop on autism or neurodiversity in general. I'll definitely note that down. But bringing neurodiversity into this particular question, using STOP or any CBT-based skills for regulating mood for autism, CBT is quite a good toolkit of support. And if you do feel that you need to have support, I know that I'll Talk, it's IAPT, they have CBT counsellors there. Youth Trust if you're under 25. There are, and your GP 111. These are all really good places to go if you need to have a talk to a mental health practitioner. Each GP has a mental health practitioner in their surgeries now. So if you're on the island, so there are lots of. And of course, is Europia, we are accessible through the mental health practitioners at the GP as well as through single point of access, which is it's an island service. So there's so many, there are a lot of services out there if you do feel you need support, but in general, using these very simple grounding techniques mastering them. Somebody in the comments earlier said about writing it down. That's one of them, writing it down. Just getting it out of your head, physically out of your head onto paper, can be quite rewarding.
Absolutely, it's worth bearing that in mind. Like, we said at the start of the session here, so many different ways that we can potentially manage, and the end goal has to be for everybody. It's just trying different things to work out what it is that works for you.
Absolutely.
So I can see we're roughly coming up to time, is what we are now. But I just want to finish by thanking everybody for joining us on the journey today. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you guys. Hopefully this has had the effect of giving you some food for thought, perhaps giving you some consideration for what may work for you and what you may want to adopt. But recognising the importance of this topic in the context of mental well-being is just absolutely huge. And if you've identified any of this today, you now have direction, is what you do. And a continuation from that If you're not with us, if you are based on the Isle of Wight and you'd like some additional support, please do not hesitate to seek a referral to us.
Absolutely.
And we can take that further from there.
But anyway, hope you all have a brilliant weekend. It's a Friday,
It is
so
Friday.
have a brilliant Friday. Take very good care.
Take care.